How reliable is the historical portrait of Jesus in the Gospels? For generations, Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper has left us with an impression of what the meal that Jesus shared with his disciples looked like that night before his crucifixion. But how accurate is the Da Vinci classic rendering? And more importantly, what about those who say that the real story of what happened that night is different than the Gospel record? These scholars are convinced that the historical evidence gives us reason to take another look at the Last Supper. Jesus, man, Messiah, or more, on this day of discovery.
For the past decade, these New Testament scholars have been working with historical evidence for key events in the life of Jesus. Evidence, they say, creates a compelling portrait of Jesus in the Gospels.
One of the most familiar events in the life of Jesus is the Last Supper. The Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples. According to the Gospels in the New Testament, the meal took place in an upper room.
According to the Gospel of Mark, the meal took place in Jerusalem during the Jewish feast of Passover. Together with the other Gospel writers, Mark says Jesus took the story of Passover sacrifice and gave it a very personal meaning, a meaning linked to his own death.
And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many." The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14.
But some question whether the conversation really occurred the way Mark recorded it. Some historians suggest that those words were added to the story later, created years after that Last Supper, to leave the impression that Jesus knew he was about to die and that he wanted to give the Passover meal new meaning. So to take another look at the historical setting for that meal, 3 of the study group's New Testament scholars agreed to meet with us. We met in a room that is often used by tourists and pilgrims to experience for themselves what it might have been like for the disciples of that last Passover meal. To sit down was difficult, as we attempted to take our place at the kind of reclining table that Jesus and his disciples would have used.
Okay. All right. The upper room, the Last Supper. Let's put it in context.
Well, we're in the time of the Passover. It's debated whether we're directly on the night of the Passover meal or just in the Passover season. And
is that important?
It's not that important because, like Christmas, it overlays everything that's taking place, and the meal that we're having has the flavor of we're in the Passover season. That's really the important point.
The Gospel writer Luke indicates Jesus' anticipation of eating the Passover meal with his 12 disciples.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb must be killed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." The Gospel of Luke, chapter 22.
The story of Passover, still retold annually in Jewish homes around the world, remembers how God delivered the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. The ritual meal includes various symbolic elements: wine for the blessings of freedom, matzah or unleavened bread, for there was no time for bread to rise as they left Egypt, bitter herbs for the bitterness of slavery, and a shank bone of lamb to remember the night of departure when lambs were sacrificed in the Jewish homes of Egypt. For on that night, blood was put on the doorframes so that the death angel would pass over and not take the life of a firstborn son in that home.
And of course, the Passover reviews the foundational salvation event in the history of Israel. And now Jesus is going to take that event and explain his own mission in light of what is about to take place.
Okay, so the meal itself looks backward, right? That's what you're saying.
Right. That's right.
It's celebrating the Exodus and God's redeeming his people out of Egypt.
And once a year, the Jewish people to this day will remember that great event.
Yeah, that singular event that repeatedly, all through the Old Testament, they hark back to the Old Testament. Remember when God brought you out of Egypt through the Passover.
Now, as Jesus in that last week moves toward the cross, what's he doing with it?
Well, he's going to take it and he's going to explain what's getting ready to happen to him. He's going to announce the fact that someone is betraying him on the one hand, and then he's going to turn around and change the symbolism of this meal, of this period of the year, in light of what's getting ready to take place.
I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 22.
Okay, now you, in your study group, over time, you made this supper an important part of your study, right? Why did you do it? Why did you put attention on this meal?
Well, because it gives us Jesus' own view of how he has not only understood his mission and ministry, but now how he understands his own imminent death.
Okay, is this a matter of debate, like in the scholarly community? There are a lot of different perspectives, right?
Yes, that's true. The one thing that's important here is to realize that the tradition of this meal and what was said at it, it appears in some of our earliest New Testament texts. It's alluded to in 1 Corinthians. And it's alluded to as a part of the tradition that the church has passed on. So I think that's an important feature in understanding how far back the tradition of the words of Jesus goes.
The Apostle Paul wrote his first letter to the Corinthians in 56 AD to followers of Christ living in Corinth, Greece. His words show that within just a few years of Jesus' death, the church was remembering the Last Supper in their gatherings.
For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. 1 Corinthians chapter 11.
Nobody doubts that he died. Nobody doubts really that he was crucified. But what's the reason for that? Was he just simply a martyr? Was this all just accidental? Or did this have to do with something grander in his life's mission?
Okay, now how does that relate to the supper? Are you saying that there's a link between that issue
Very definitely.
and what was happening at this meal?
Yeah, what's been going on is that he started several months back with predictions that he was going to be arrested.
Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the third day. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16.
And skeptical scholars would look at that and say, well, how could he know that? How could he really know what was going on? And even if he could, well, that doesn't mean that there was anything really significant in his death. And so they'll doubt this meal where he declares, in this meal, he declares the mission of his life. There is a purpose behind his death.
Okay, so what do you do if you're talking to someone, whether they're a scholar or not, and they don't look at the Bible the way we do? They don't accept that it's assumed, and they've not concluded that it's the Word of God. How do you begin to talk to people like that?
There actually isn't all that much disagreement about the timing of this meal in many ways, but whether we can know what was said there and whether Jesus had anticipated his death in the way Mike was discussing, that's often what is debated. Now, we do have precedent for for Jesus' being able to contemplate what might happen to him if he challenges the leadership in one way or another, whether it be Roman or Jewish, and that's John the Baptist. John the Baptist was beheaded for challenging the leadership at a moral level. And so this isn't something that Jesus would go into blind. We don't have to posit that he has some type of vision or something like that in order to contemplate what might happen to him if he begins to challenge the leadership. This meal makes sense that he would anticipate that something catastrophic is getting ready to happen.
And according to the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus would soon face death, not by accident, but by voluntarily allowing himself to be sacrificed in complete fulfillment of the Passover. According to the Gospel accounts, Jesus and his disciples shared that Last Supper here in Jerusalem. Even though the exact location of the supper is uncertain, there's a long history of Christian activity at this traditional site to recall what Jesus said and did. Much of this current structure, with its dramatic arches, dates to the Crusader period. Although some are convinced that Jesus would not have used the occasion of Passover observance to talk about his own death, this group of scholars has come to a different conclusion.
And so what we're trying to do is to fit this into its context. What was happening as his ministry unfolded that
Going
led
forward
to this
rather
point?
than
That's right,
backwards.
that's right.
And in the context of Judaism, the possibility of someone who is righteous being a sacrifice on behalf of the nation in one way or another was beginning to be considered and discussed. And we have a book like 4th Maccabees where this theme is raised. And so even though this is not biblical material, these kinds of thoughts are beginning to enter into Jewish thinking and Jewish consideration. What kind of action does this represent? And in a religion as traditionally rooted as Judaism is, in one sense, the fact that whether it's biblical or not is irrelevant if it's being theologically contemplated.
Say that a different way.
He's in pain, remember.
Pain doesn't excuse everything.
Well, that's right. The point here is that Judaism is a religion not only based on Torah, not only based on law, not only based on the first 5 books, not only based on what we call the Old Testament, but it has a tradition built around it. And so these other texts introduce theological ideas that people are contemplating about the significance of events and what they might mean. So when Jesus...
So do I understand, excuse me, that you're saying that the issue here is whether or not what happened at this meal fits conceptually and theologically into ideas and anticipations?
Yes, ideas, anticipations, or reflections. It may not even be anticipations, just mere reflections about what an act means. And so when a righteous person dies, the possibility of a righteous person dying on behalf of someone is something that Jewish people were beginning to contemplate and to think about and even articulate. That's why I mentioned 4th Maccabees. 4th Maccabees, this book outside the Bible, is an articulation of this kind of an idea.
Of a righteous person dying.
Dying for the benefit of other people. And of course, the roots of that, if you really want to press it, the roots of that can go into a text like Isaiah 53. So it isn't like it's without biblical roots.
And Isaiah 53, for those who don't know,
is a passage about the suffering servant and the person who is going to be some kind of a sacrifice on behalf of others is going to die an innocent death. He's going to die unjustly. He's going to die silently. There are all kinds of ideas associated with this. Now, the church develops a lot of this later, but these ideas are there, and this strand of tradition exists.
More than 600 years before Jesus, the prophet Isaiah had mysteriously foreseen a righteous servant who, like a sacrificial Passover lamb, would bear the sin of others. Isaiah's description of this person is remarkably specific.
He was despised and rejected by men. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life. Isaiah chapter 53.
That's why it's so significant that it's coming at Passover. I mean, this is in the history of Israel, that blood was shed so that people would be covered and that they would then be able to be released from their bondage and find freedom as a new people. And what Jesus is saying is that my death, the blood that I will now shed on the cross, is what will set people free from their sins. It will be a sacrifice, but it will be a sacrifice for their sins, because he is the one who can cover the sins of many, of all.
So again, according to the Gospels, Jesus linked this meal to his anticipated death. He wanted it to be remembered as a new memorial, a new covenant. This Passover meal became the first communion observance. According to the Gospel of Mark, it was after that meal that Jesus and his disciples, except for Judas, left Jerusalem and walked down across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. There, Jesus once again told them what was about to happen.
And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "All of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee." The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14.
Now think about what that involves, to take one of the most fundamental symbols of the Jewish faith, which is the Exodus, and all of a sudden begin to talk about another kind of deliverance that's going to take place. I think most people, when they think about the Last Supper, don't even think about that dimension of it.
But there's another point of continuity, and that is that Passover was looking back to the Exodus as salvation by God in the past. But the symbolism out of the Exodus was being used in the Old Testament prophets and in other literature, using the same language to talk about what they began to expect God was going to do in the future.
Right.
So
Yes,
Exodus
exactly.
language, right. this language of Passover and Exodus, is also being used to describe what they hoped God was going to do in the future. So I think what's happening is Jesus is tapping into a bit of that concept as well. That it's not just purely looking backwards, but it's Jesus is taking these hopes for the future and, in a sense, embodying them in himself.
And it is the wrapping around of these ideas around himself that is in some senses, the radical move.
Yeah.
Because now it isn't just God who's going to do this, but it is the sacrifice that I am getting prepared to be that is at the core of this story.
So as Jesus and his disciples come to this meal, all of this anticipation and these ideas really come to focus in the symbolism of the elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's in Jesus' mind about what's about to happen.
Right, and this is not just another meal. Some have tried to even turn it into some kind of Hellenistic farewell meal, but this is not just another meal. This is the culmination of his time with his disciples. This is his last night with them. He is giving them a very clear statement of what his life mission is all about. And his life mission wasn't just to call a few disciples. His life mission wasn't just to start a new movement. His life mission was now wrapped up in being what Paul will call in 1 Corinthians the Passover lamb. He is going to be the sacrifice for the sins of the people. And it's a powerful. I just can't even imagine how powerful that night would have been, and yet how mind-boggling it would have been.
I also think that there's a reflective element that gets created by this meal, and we see it in the fact that the meal is still celebrated today. That lives on. And so there's a sense in which in any church gathering, the church gathers around the table to remember what Jesus Christ has done. You're here at the table with us. You are sharing in that moment. You are sharing in what Jesus Christ has done in that moment. And as a result of that, you too share in the participation of life that this meal represents. Because another thing that's important about meals is they represent a symbol of fellowship, a picture of fellowship that one has. And so Jesus says, I've been longing to have this meal with you because he knew it was up ahead. He knew it was the last meal that he was going to have. And he also knew that this fellowship and acceptance, this was a moment he was never going to have again with them again.
Okay, so again, if I understand the work that you've been doing with with a whole series of important biblical events is to look at each piece as being a part of the picture,
Right.
but looking at how that part of the puzzle fits into the whole, right?
Right.
And that's what you're seeing with this
exactly
meal.
right.
That's exactly right. And in light of the tension that has been created by Jesus coming into the city, the temple cleansing, the things that he has said, the controversies that he's had, he understands now, he understands that his death is imminent, and he is being very clear to his disciples about what that's going to involve, and that they are going to have to be prepared to walk down potentially the same kind of path that he is getting ready to embark on entering.
And yet how little they really understood at the time.
About any
it's
of
amazing,
it. Exactly.
isn't it?
Exactly.
So let me ask you then, man, for those who may have even participated in communion or any different kind of memorial meal as we practice in the Christian faith, but have never really put it together, and now hearing you, what would you like them to do with this? I mean, where do you think these ideas should take us?
You know, this has hit me over the years in a powerful way that, you know, so often we just do church. We do ceremonies. We do religious ritual. We may take communion, Lord's Supper, once a month or once a year or once a week. And yet it just becomes so trivial. And if we lose the depth of what Jesus' life was all about, what he came to do, to enter into history as the Son of God, to take on a life that would then be given willingly and sacrificed for us, so that he descended into the hell of torture, of payment of sin, so that I can be free, so that I can find salvation, so all of us can know what it means to be free in Christ. We should never trivialize communion, the Lord's Supper, by just taking a little wafer, drinking a little juice. We should basically weep and then rejoice at what Jesus meant.
I think the other part of this meal is what has become attached to it when it gets observed as communion. And that's the idea, in effect, you remember my death until I come again. This is not just about a death.
Right.
This is about a death that leads into life. It leads into a new life for Jesus in his resurrected form. It leads into a new life to anyone who embraces what Jesus offers. And so as a result, sometimes when you take the Lord's Supper, you have this sense of solemnity and almost a glumness. I'm focusing on the death. And sometimes I wonder, well, we forget that the meal is about fellowship. We forget that the meal is about life. And so it transcends that death. That's part of the point, is that Jesus didn't die just to die. He died to bring life. And so that is part of what's being celebrated as well. And sometimes I don't think we appreciate that enough.
Yeah.
The thing that I think is significant for me is that in the ancient Near Eastern world, the Mediterranean world, the Greco-Roman world, Jesus' world, when you ate together, you were in fellowship with the people you ate with. It was a sign of agreement and of oneness. And for me, when I celebrate communion, it is a celebration of my fellowship that I have with God, that I am accepted at his table.
And what's interesting about this meal is that oftentimes it's a family meal. And so now look at what Jesus has done in saying who his family is. And this meal, when we observe the community, is Jesus is saying, you're a part of my family. So it's this intimacy, this acceptance, and as such, I think it's a very, very powerful reminder that Jesus' life and ministry was designed to invite people into fellowship with the living God.
When visiting sites linked to important events in the life of Jesus, like this traditional location for the Last Supper, I often sense a spiritual bond with those who come, as with followers from centuries past. Sometimes I just watch, listen as a group prays, sings, or quietly pauses to remember the one who drank the cup of suffering for them, with a promise to return.